This is not your father's MediaTek anymore. They are taking a brand new approach to all of these markets that they're in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Circuit. I am Ben Bajarin.
Greeting, agents. I'm Jay Goldberg.
So there was a lot that happened this week, both news and, we've been stacking events, at least for those in the analyst circuit. I attended MediaTek's Analyst Day this week, which is an interesting, company. I've followed them for actually a really long time because
Really
back
long
in
time.
the 2000s, we were
Yeah.
consulting with a company named Zoran, who was
Okay.
the DVD player media engine, and their largest competitor was MediaTek, who had 70% share of the DVD codec compression media player APs back in the day. So
I remember when back in like 2007, 6, I was like, I remember I was at the bank and I would bring MediaTek. I'd say, hey, I just got back from China and there's this company called MediaTek that's doing all these crazy things in mobile phones. And like nobody had heard of them. Like investors hadn't heard of them.
yeah, it's tough also because they're on the Taiwan exchange. So like I get it, but if you're savvy investors like the ones that we talk to, especially to the subject we're going to talk about custom ASICs, you follow them because you're just curious. Do they hurt, Broadcom or Marvell or companies you do cover, right, competitively?
Well, I think that's the interesting thing is for a long time, nobody in the US took them seriously in probably going back to DVDs, and then nobody took them seriously in mobile. And now everybody knows them as for a long time as a mobile company. And now it's the same thing. They're just being seen as sort of second source, low cost competition to ASIC vendors like Marvell and Broadcom.
Yeah,
And if you look, I mean, they crushed the DVD market. And then if you look at where they are in mobile today, they are fully competitive with Qualcomm
absolutely.
technically and margin wise, they're fully competitive. And I don't know what they're going to do in AI, but they have a legitimate business here.
Yeah.
Also, for what it's worth, they've been doing custom ASICs before we called them custom ASICs. I mean, they were doing this 10 years ago. They were doing custom ASICs for a bunch of people. They've been in that
Yes.
business a long time.
Yes, they have. So there's two things just to mention. So again, if you're not terribly familiar, with MediaTek, as sort of Jay said, right? They have a lot of history back into silicon in consumer electronics that parlayed into mobile, where again they were a huge threat, kind of across the board. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think in like India or somewhere they dabbled with a vendor who co-branded with them in smartphones for like a period of time, like a very short cycle. Um, because I remember work we were doing with Nokia back then, they were freaking out about some joint thing MediaTek was doing with phones. And anyway, lots of back history in consumer electronics. Their CEO, also Rick Tsai, was the CEO of TSMC from 2005 to I believe 2009 ish, and chairman. So deep roots in the Taiwanese ecosystem and supply chain. But what's always intrigued me about this company is they've always been extremely humble when it comes to their technology. And I say that because there was a lot of external belief that I had about this company when I started, coming to a lot of their events 7 years ago. And they never talked about like their customers or who they were in, right? And so we were at this event and all of a sudden we find out that they're in all the Amazon Echo devices. Like at the time that Amazon Echo was like starting to sell like hotcakes, and we're like, why didn't anybody tell us? Like you guys are the SoC in this, and actually doing some interesting co-work with Amazon to optimize silicon to Alexa and those Echoes. And they're like, well, we just don't like to talk about our customers. And so for the longest time, like the view was you're just an ARM shop. You're not necessarily an ARM licensee, which they aren't. They are a licensee of CSS and standard IP. They're not doing custom microarchitectures like NVIDIA is doing and Apple, etc. Again, they could become one of those licensees, but they're not. So the theory was, oh, you're just doing custom ARM stuff. You don't have any of your own IP. And for the longest time, like they didn't refute that message, even though it's not true. And I was always like, other than the PMIC, I always knew they had a really good PMIC, but just because like analysis I had seen at the board level from some friendlies was always like their power management's really good, and that was unique IP. And they kind of didn't want to talk about that, but then anyway, fast forward to now, and I'm sitting in this presentation that they're giving on their launch in the data center. And if anybody who knows this space, you know that they've been talking about this for a while. They have had rumblings of customers. We do know they have customers. It's sort of like a secret, but not really a secret who those customers are. And all of a sudden they're like, "Hey, we're going to tell you about our SerDes and our optical IP and our packaging IP and all these things." I was like, "Wait a minute. Where the crap was this like 2 years ago when you first started saying like why we're going to get into ASICs? Like, why was there not a broader technology story of all this IP that you guys actually have, when again the world just assumed you were an arms shop?" And so I thought that was interesting in that culturally they're willing to start be a little bit more aggressive in talking up their IP, because they do have a lot. I'm not going to say they have all of it, but they've got a lot, and that's a interesting change. And anyway, we'll talk about some of the things they walked us through, but for the first time they're starting to tell these more relevant technical stories and show their technical chops, and that's a very new approach for MediaTek.
I think there is something different about the way that U.S. semiconductor companies handle marketing versus pretty much every other semiconductor company geography in the world. It's a recurring theme. There are a few countries I can think of that have pretty deep semiconductor engineering talent, and marketing is not one of the skills that they teach in semiconductor schools. It's interesting to me. And certainly U.S. semiconductor companies can all do a better job marketing, but Taiwanese companies in particular, I would say Israeli companies too, really struggle
Yeah.
uh, with that. And it's funny. I've recently been working with a couple uh, foreign-born engineers and on a project, and getting them to be sort of more confident in what they're offering and just sort of talk it up. They it's like a weird humility muscle that they just like they feel uncomfortable promoting themselves.
Very, very, and it's like, it's again, it's one of those things where you're totally right. Like US companies, like this is the thing. They're like, look how good my engineer, like let our engineers talk. And even like at these MediaTek events, like I would ask like these really hard like questions, even around their NPU, which is actually pretty good, and some of their own IP, and they never wanted to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I was like just what like and I had sort of told him, I said, "Listen guys, I get it, but like what weirds me out was I used to ask these same questions to like Huawei and others, and their non-answer to me was more of a red flag than it was that they were just shy about their IP." And so I was like, so I feel like you're hiding something when you don't want to tell us about these things. Like that's just bad mistake. But anyway, that was sort of like my concern. Like, why don't you want to say, or why don't you let some of the technical engineers, the designers, out of the cages so they can start talking about the things that they're doing, even in R&D? And it just took a long, long time. So luckily, they are at that stage now where they're willing to tell these stories. Our event was kind of like the broader coming out party for ASIC, even though Rick has talked about this at a handful of events. They've led investors to the kind of dollars that they're expecting this year and next year. So the cat's been out of the bag, but a lot more details about what they're doing in advanced nodes, advanced packaging, optical, their SerDes, all of that stuff was brought more to light at this event. There's a bunch of slides the world had never seen that I was tweeting, and like people were like, "Holy crap, where are you? Like I've never seen any of these stuff, and I follow MediaTek forever." So it was a good event. I think the true launch will be as revenues start kicking in, and it's clear who their customers are and which those products are. But anyway, high level point, as we were joking with other analysts and MediaTek folks, this is not your father's MediaTek anymore. they are taking a brand new approach to all of these markets that they're in, right? Not just phones and IoT and compute right at the edge, but now ASICs, which is the cash cow of cash cows, um, in an interesting developing competitive market, because it isn't really just, it was Broadcom, Marvell, GUC, and Alchip with varying degrees of who brought what to what. Broadcom being the dominant. And now I think MediaTek's going to enter that conversation in a relevant way, and people are going to start talking about this more as they think about the custom ASIC landscape.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying before, MediaTek has been doing custom ASICs for a lot. I think before Broadcom was doing TPU, almost certainly,
Oh, for
um,
sure. Yes,
long
correct.
time.
They pointed this out too. Yes.
And I think there is. I think this is a topic that investors are pretty fully aware of. There's a very active debate now about around some of the big potential MediaTek customers, which has been widely reported. It's not a secret. Everybody, it's very widely reported in the press. It's really, Google is MediaTek's big customer
Yep.
for ASICs. MediaTek's never said that, but it's widely reported, and there's a lot of very active debate in the investment community about how much share does MediaTek get there versus Broadcom,
Yeah.
and so I think investors there are very familiar with it. I do think there is still a perception that, in my mind, I think of the ASIC market as there's really two tiers. There's sort of full solution providers, and then there's sort
Yep.
of like sort of Alchip and GUC, which are just sort of doing a much lower level of support, where the designer is doing a lot more work, as opposed to Marvell and Broadcom, where they have a much heavier engineering role. And and I think there is a misconception that MediaTek is in the sort of low tier category, and they're not. They're competing against Marvell and Broadcom for some of the biggest accounts to do pretty serious amounts of work. Um, and we can debate, and I do this all the time, every day. We can debate where MediaTek is competitively against those two, but you have to benchmark it against those two, against Marvell and Broadcom, and not against Alchip and GUC and the
Yes.
right. There's
Agreed. But I think, again, right? What's interesting to me is, like I said, they for the first time started talking about their 30s. They've got 224 today on track, and 440s coming. Um, again, not too far off from the timeline of their major competitors, SerDes. So the networking IP is there. They talked a lot about all of their fabrics, from co-packaging to advanced packaging in 2.5D and 3.5D, ties to memories they have. And I think, the point, they brought this up when they first started talking to us at our analyst events, I think two years ago, I want to say. um, they kept talking up, like, look, we have a very privileged relationship at TSMC that I don't think many people understand. And again, when that is, whether or not, right, they're shipping smartphone wafers early on, they're still of the earliest adopters, so they can go through that learning process, so they can have shared learnings with TSMC, so that they can refine some of the things that they will be doing. So they're in the earliest of discussions with TSMC, and I think that is, one, an underappreciated metric, but it's one that right now, related to XPUs and whatnot, is going to become an even stronger differentiator. And I think a couple of years ago, the market was just talking about, it's the chip. Everybody just cared about the chip. Like, what chip are you making? You're going to do
right.
custom ASICs. And now that is the full solution. So you have to have a story that's not just, I've got what you need to go make an ASIC, but I've also got what you need to do the advanced packaging, to do the integration, to do 2.5 and 3.5D, to do scale up networking, to have optical IP. They're even showing some stuff they were doing in co-packaged copper and near packaged copper that I actually think are farther advanced than other people are doing at the chip level, for keeping copper up to 400 gigs per lane. So go ahead.
I was just gonna say that, the sort of more informed knock I hear on criticism I hear on MediaTek is that their selling proposition in the ASIC market is the fact that they get allocation they get preferential allocation at TSMC, which for a long time was just like, oh, these guys can't compete technologically, but I'll use
Right.
them because I get allocation. I, I won't debate that point. I don't think it's true, but let's not worry about that. My point here is just that like having allocation to TSMC is probably your biggest competitive advantage for any of these companies today. That's that matters more. It doesn't even matter how good your IP is to some degree. Can you get me wafers at TSMC? And TSMC and MediaTek have a very close relationship. They're essentially next door to each other in Shinju. They kind of grew up together. I think is there's a whole long story there, which is basically boils down to these two companies sort of were very very close from very early days, and there's a lot of overlap, and that gives MediaTek I would argue gives them a preferred position at TSMC. They have a lot more than that, but in this today's market, like that's enough. Like I'll take the allocation.
I agree. I agree. And I think again, right, if you just step back from one, they are a larger customer in revenue to TSMC than any competitor in the custom ASIC space, right? So I'm just talking about custom ASIC. So they're bigger than Broadcom, bigger than Marvell by quite a lot. They also do a lot more wafers. They're probably top three in wafers at TSMC. Um, and I say that only because GPUs are gigantic, right? In terms of monolithic, they do at least top three, just a little behind or in front of Qualcomm, but Apple obviously does the most. Um, but their ability to have that wafer allocation, and again, the priority that they have in all the aspects of under one roof at TSMC, um, yeah, I think again, right? These are things that you can't take for granted when you're the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons, others of the world who, are like, yeah, like working with you becomes an attractive proposition because of all of these things. Now again, so going back to the business model change, I had always believed that the thing that would benefit MediaTek the most would be customer owned tooling. And we've discussed this as a debate for right a long time. Um, but their shared position with TSMC has very specific advantages to the design technology services co-optimization and the system services co-optimization, which is a leading edge uh, program to refine your process and your technology. And you're involved in that with TSMC. Like you're actively working with them on future process and packaging and whatnot. And so the fact that more customers may want to do more of their own IP, which is the trend for Google, the one that Broadcom and Hawktime's been like, oh, it's okay, but it's not going to be that big of a thing. Um, I do think the market is moving in that direction for a couple customers, maybe not all of them, but a couple customers. And if that continues at that rate, that's where I think the business model that MediaTek is bringing, plus the technology story, is really the best like opportunity for them, right? As it shapes up.
That's a pretty contentious statement, and I think we need to unpack that a little because this idea of customer owned tooling, which is basically saying if you're a hyperscaler, you're designing your own chip, to what degree do you need an ASIC partner like MediaTek or Marvell or Alchip or MediaTek or Broadcom? It's sort of like it's a sliding scale, right? Some customers need Broadcom to do everything for them. Some need like Microsoft or Google, need very little from their ASIC provider, so they go with an Alchip or a GUC. And then what MediaTek is essentially saying is somewhere in the middle where Google's going to do some of their IP themselves, um, and it's like you said, Hawk mentioned it on the call as sort of dismissing it. People debate this with me every day, and I think it's unclear. And I think rather than think of it as a point, it's either this or that. It's like I said, it's a sort of a sliding scale of some customers are going to do it, some aren't. Some are going to try it and go back. Some are going to avoid it and then come back to it. So all the hyperscalers are going to continue doing chips. It is. I think it's hard to argue that all the hyperscalers are eventually going to move to fully custom owned tooling and just doing it all themselves and just having Alchip sort of do the last couple steps. I don't think that's going to happen. I think some people are going to need to use Broadcom in the future and Marvell in the future. I don't think, but I could be wrong. Like it's a pretty complex picture right now. It's very dynamic. All the hyperscalers are going through their processes and iterating, and I don't think anyone's sort of locked down on the right model. We've certainly seen some hyperscalers try one path and have that fail and need more
Yes.
support.
Right.
Um,
Correct.
so I think what will
I
happen in
would
the
say two things.
future.
I don't.
I think what's going to happen in the future is all the hyperscalers are working on their own chips. Some of those projects are going to fail this year, and then the question is, do the hyperscalers move up a level from an Alchip to a MediaTek or from a MediaTek to a Broadcom, or do they just
Yeah.
abandon
Right.
custom altogether and go with AMD? And that's
Bye.
I think that's the framework for the whole debate.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I don't think, right, again, it's a one size fits all, both chip or business model or vendor program. I think again, all these players will compete. Um, if anything, I would be a little bit more concerned about like Juicy, for example. Like you might need them less. Alchip, I think, can still be there, but again, they're largely Amazon, who, again, as I pointed out, is a large customer of MediaTek in devices. So it's not like they don't already have a relationship with them there to start leveraging. I mean, really, every customer in the ecosystem you're talking about is the customer of MediaTek in some capacity. So they already have a lot of those relationships. But what I do think happens is I to my point again, right? When you were just talking about the chip, and the chip has now moved to the rack, and the entire element of compute, the rack scale compute is the pod. I think we're going to see variations of chips from the custom from the XPU guys. So it's not just it's a Matmul accelerator or it's a networking chip. I think you're going to see variations of training chips, some big, some small, variations of inference chips, some big, some small, all the networking, right, that go into that. So I think you'll see reasons why people will pick certain vendors over others for certain ASIC programs versus the entire ASIC program from a Google, a Microsoft, and Amazon, and OpenAI, et cetera, is at one customer. That's essentially like my thesis, that this fragments, and each person has a reason in which they'll support a program initiative by a hyperscaler or a frontier lab company or whoever.
Well, then that just expands my framework to take in NVIDIA, because that's the spectrum here. Is you can go to NVIDIA and get everything, including your networking and your rack design and your whole data center design. There are companies that are going to do that, and then at the other end of the spectrum is you do you mix and match and do everything you want exactly the way you customize it all. Google, that's sort of what Google's doing, where it's like everything is they're doing their own networking, they're doing their
They're
own
doing everything. Yeah.
accelerator, they're doing their own CPU, um, right? And they're increasingly pushing down the stack to do more and more in house, and everyone else is somewhere in between.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think with NVIDIA, it's that is the argument, right? How much do you want to build versus buy? Um, but I still think pain points will emerge for these programs that they go try to solve. The other thing I thought about that was interesting on the back of sort of the ARM stuff was, obviously, MediaTek has CPU IP. They can make those big, they can make those small. And what if a hyperscaler who's building, let's just say again, Google, who's building their TPU program with MediaTek also decides they want to build an agentic CPU, so not a cloud CPU like we talked about, right? The whole point of why does NVIDIA believe Vera CPUs should exist and ARM believes AGI CPUs should exist is that there's a derivative of your CPU architecture that's not cloud native that becomes more ASIC native. Um, MediaTek would actually be right there to be able to say we can help you do an agentic CPU to go along with your XPU and all the networking, right? Because they have those IPs. So I just think it's interesting because all of this is unsettled. Like we just don't know. Like it's changing so much. We have no idea where it goes. But my broad takeaway, as I said, is if the market moves to more wanting a more flexible business model and a flexible approach to mix and matching IP, I think that's where MediaTek's trying to say we're your right partner.
I think they're firmly in the mix, and where they end up exactly is anybody's guess at this point. But they're firmly in the mix.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, revenues will hit this year and accelerate into next year. So the good thing is we'll be able to see how successful this program is by one particular line item that should keep going up and to the right. Um, so anyway, I tweeted a lot of these charts in case everybody follows me on Twitter and wanted to see some of the very specific slides that MediaTek had not shown publicly before, even in Rick Sai's presentations. So check that out, and this will be one I'm sure we will talk about again, either in the end of the year or as new developments happen. So anyway, that was good. So from MediaTek to memory, I'll let you. I did a brief memory update so I could this week in the diligence chat so I can talk about. But let's talk briefly about memory. I mean, it might be that we talk about memory every week. I don't know, but let's talk about this week's take on memory.
Well, so I think we at this point we need like little theme music and a little sub segment for the show
Yeah.
because we're going to talk about just short things that are in shortage, and like top of the list, of course, is memory. Memory is still very short, and this week confused me to no end because the memory stocks had a pretty rough week. I mean, everything had a rough week. We are, at war, but like memory has been getting punished the last 2 weeks around things like we talked about last week. Google has a memory tool, and there's some startup that came out or some academic thing that came out of I don't know that is also claiming to do incredible things with memory. And there's this whole debate about somebody's gonna start using mobile memory more for AI stuff, and so the memory stocks got hit this week on a whole bunch of like weird news about memory. And so that's going on in the market. But then meanwhile, you and I have both had sounds like lots of conversations this week about people actually trying to buy memory, and it's impossible. Like like all it sounds like all the memory makers are sold out into I mean through next year into like 2028 is numbers I've been hearing for when the memory shortage is eased now. And I don't know how to reconcile the street's view and practitioner operators view of memory because it is like when memory stocks like these big 10 $100 billion companies move 10% a week, 10% in a day, up or down, it tells me that the market doesn't know how to value anything.
Yes, that's correct.
Right now I certainly don't. So
I don't
it's
either.
very confusing.
I don't either, but just, Micron's a good example of like what it got to, I believe was, I think it might have even gotten to the 330s. I could look, but um, the compression that multiple took was almost unlike a compression, even in cyclical cycles, and basically believes that none of the guidance or estimates to next year are real. And you're kind of like, it's very, very hard to find any evidence that that's true. Now, again, if your belief is that we're peak right now and it holds at peak for another year, that's fine, right? Because you want to trade before you get to the downside of a cyclical cycle. I understand that. But just on the basis of fundamentals, it was hard to understand sort of that reaction. Now again, you're right. We don't know where things are going. My supply chain conversations have made this sound like it's going to go to 2030. And a lot of that is because wafer allocation is shifting in the majority to HBM.
Yeah.
All existing memory capacity moves to the majority of HBM, and you're not going to have any relief come on for 2 years at a minimum. Dude, DRAM and NAND and DDR and all of the above, SOCOM, which is trying to now get to scale, like, good luck. Prices of those things will only go up and to the right, and you just watch, like, spot pricing is no longer the good way to look at this, for example, with long-term agreements shifting toward capacity commitments and prices being negotiated on a fluctuating cycle, which means the memory vendors are like, no, I'm not going to lock you into a price right now because in 2 quarters it's going to be higher than it is right now. And we know that. And you all just going to have to accept it. Like this is never say the memory guys aren't going to milk a cycle for all it's worth. And this is going to be a multi-year, if not longer, cycle.
Yeah, I again, I don't know. I mean, I'm I'm I am confused by all this. Whereas I talked to my teenage son about memory a lot because he builds his own PCs and he's into gaming and he hates AI because he can't get anything he wants. He can't get new GPUs,
Of course, right?
updated gaming
Blame
GPUs.
everything's AI's fault.
It's and he can't get memory, and so he is. And so I was talking to him about it this weekend, and so I am confuzzled. That was the word he used. Confuzzled by what is happening in memory. I will say I mean, I'm just gonna let me play the devil's advocate. Let me play the other side of it because right and the I think the opposing take would be every cycle you hear that same language like, oh, this is incredible, it's going to go on forever, and eventually it won't. um
Yeah, right.
and I think what's happening, I think what was really critical to watch, and you touched on this, is this idea of spot pricing versus contract pricing, because historically contracts will move towards spot, right? And so if spot prices keeps going up, contract prices will keep going up. And we talked about this a couple months ago, where during SanDisk or Micron's earnings, where they've all been talking a lot about long-term agreements and the extent to which that sort of locks in long-term pricing. I don't think that's actually taking place. Like I don't think we're having these, nobody's signing a 5-year memory
No,
contract with locked-in
no.
pricing today. But what you're seeing is, in order to have a conversation with a memory supplier, you need to sign a long-term agreement that agrees to a certain purchase quantity,
Yep.
and then prices are negotiated every quarter, which is not that different from the past, but there is that sort of underlying basic uh, volume agreement in place. And this is a lot like what we saw with trailing edge foundry space during the pandemic, when everything was so short, and Global Foundry signed all those agreements and long-term agreements that really put people in a tough spot for a long time. And that didn't, like, I wouldn't say that I think that had very mixed results for Global Foundries, because it certainly helped their numbers for a period, probably still continues to be seen in their numbers, but it also definitely put a crimp in their relationship with customers long term. People remember that. And no one's going to say that now about memory guys. Everybody loves the memory suppliers. They're our favorite people. But I have to wonder if when this cycle turns in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, um, how people still feel about memory companies then. But right, like, I don't know. I mean, there's a debate we could have about, is this structural, and are we just, has the memory industry now just shifted to something different, or are we just like in a super cycle that's going to last for 3 years and then?
Yeah. I mean, I would say it's unlikely that GPU demand remains up and to the right and memory doesn't. Like those two cycles all feel fairly like I mean the whole thing is correlated, right, across the board. Like we're building the semiconductor industry as a whole is moving from something that it was when it was a $600 billion a year market to something that probably by 2031 or later is actually going to be now 2 trillion. And if you just follow the lines, right, it took what 40 years, I don't know, to get it where, I mean, we're not at $1 trillion yet, but we've been waiting for that moment. It's probably going to happen this year, and memory is going to be half of that. um and then it's probably going to go to 2 trillion in like 4 years. Like that's essentially the path that we're on. So you're moving from an industry that sustained very little growth to incredible growth. And I would struggle to see like that entire thing go back to half, like just half. It might shrink some, but it's probably not going to just half. Um, so within there are these structural dynamics of then what are new baselines? Like that's a conversation I have, like what's a new baseline? This is not your grandfather's semiconductor industry. This is a new era of semis. Okay, but what's our new like structural foundation that can hold steady? And we don't know. We have no idea. But this whole thing is correlated. It's growing, maybe it peaks, but cyclicality is going to be very, very different in the future. It might still be there, but again, it's not going to go all of a sudden semiconductor industry is back at $600 billion a year or $800 billion a year. Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, but I don't think it will have. I don't think semiconductor demand will have. The question is, when does it stop growing, right?
Yes.
And
Right.
we're going to be, I yeah, we're going to be dating this for a long time.
Yeah.
But
Correct.
it's important to remember that you quoted a statistic now. What is it? 30-40% of that $1 trillion TAM this year, that $1 trillion market this year is
Is
going to be memory.
is memory and probably more than half next year. Yeah.
Yeah, so more than half. But units are way down, right? It's all pricing. It's all
All
pricing.
pricing.
It's all
Yeah.
pricing, and that can move much faster than anything else, right? And so I think for the moment, I think you think about most Wall Street models go out 2 years at most, 8 quarters, and there's a decent chance that the memory cycle lasts beyond the period in which most people are modeling it today.
Yeah. I think that's reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah. Well, again, shortages are shortages. This,
we got
it's
to add
just
to the list.
weird.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but in memory, it's interesting to me. Like you said, people think it's peaked, has hard to value it, and then the question becomes like, when does everybody realize? I guess it hasn't. It's like at some point in time, you have to realize a lot has changed, and the overall group sentiment needs to evolve. Something will convince them. Is my point. And at some point, once people I think recognize this, then I think we're in a little bit of a different market. But we're not there yet, obviously, relative to memory. So
Yeah. I just want to add on, as long as we're talking about shortages, we also have new shortages to add to the list this week. So last week we had helium as it is in shortage. The new one we found out about this week is tungsten. I don't even know where tungsten is used. I don't actually think it's a semiconductor thing. I think it's a somewhere else power chain thing. Tungsten is short supply, and like if the reasons for it weren't so terrible, it would be almost comical to the extent that we're always finding shortages. But then I think the much more serious one, more significant than helium, is water, right? Taiwan is in a drought, and I think that is uh, that's actually a concern to me because Taiwan has sort of structural water issues that they've been dealing with for
right,
years.
right,
They're an island, and it doesn't rain as much, so that's a concern. And looking at all these things, right? There's other stuff that I was reading this week about transformers, and
yep,
the list goes
same,
on. I,
yep,
I think there is a real concern that like probably not this year, but next year we just can't build what what the industry wants. It just cannot be built. We'll start to see more and more delays
yeah,
for data centers specifically, right? And whether
yeah.
it's the electricity or the transformers or some other random component,
Yeah.
and it will all be constrained by all those things plus TSMC's capacity.
So the transformer one is interesting because I came across this stat. The average age of a transformer is around 35 years, and they cannot stay like these things don't go to 45, 50 years. So a lot of transformers are needing to be fixed. And then I put out a note this week on the shift to 800 VDC. That's going to require a whole slew of new grid innovation and transformer innovation because they're doing all these power by sidecars right now. That's not sustainable in the long haul. Um, so you've got aged infrastructure that is going to become but to your point, like where this gets interesting then is if you're Nvidia or if you're, Broadcom, like all these companies that we like to talk about, even the hyperscalers, and the 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 concerning points that people look at, which is like, oh, your revenues aren't going up as much, but is it because of a function of the supply chain? You then start to have to explain all of the things about the supply chain that is the reason in which your growth has slowed, not demand. And that's probably going to happen in capacity, but that's going to be a weird spot, right, for everybody to be in. Um, and I'm not sure, like, it's very, like, we're stacking constraints at this point. Like, it's not like it's, oh, there's one constraint or there's two constraints or there's three, like, there's like 10, and that list keeps growing. And human labor is another part of that constraint. And so you have all these things where there's just so many. And that goes to your point. Like when you've stacked as many as we are, like we just can't solve all these problems. And eventually those dominoes start to hit, and you might want to spend $1 trillion in capex next year, but you can't.
Yeah, and it'll be very interesting to see how, for me, it'll be interesting to see how the street responds to this, right? Where the supply chain at this point is pretty highly scrutinized. People are surfacing these shortages well in advance of them actually hitting anybody's numbers. But let's say a year from now, Nvidia misses its numbers because
Yes, right. Same. Yeah.
OpenAI and Oracle and Google can't build their data centers, and so they're just pausing deliveries of Nvidia parts. Does the street look through that? I don't know. I think if it happened today, the street would, but a year from now,
Right. Not,
be very
yeah.
different.
Well, I mean, but isn't part of this, like, a lot of investors, like conversations I've been having, is like, let's go as many layers deep as we can into the supply chain to find like who's solving those constraints. So there becomes like
Yeah,
the deepest level of picks and shovels to rock miners to people who make the shoes for those who are going to mine. Like, you know what I mean? Like that becomes the interesting exercise, and where they might, right, put some money in the most attractive size for who are solving the constraints versus the companies who benefit from them in years or quarters as constraints alleviate.
yeah. I mean, that's certainly the trade that's been taking place over the last 6 months. Is investors looking for things that are second and third order derivatives.
Yeah.
People who have companies that have capacity, companies that have some critical components that's short. But I spent a lot of time looking at those names, and we're already pretty deep into it. The market, the street is pretty deep into that already. Um, and I mean, just the fact that you and I are talking about power generation, like if you like 18 months ago, it was on neither of our roadmaps. We would have never been talking about it, and here we are. It's pretty
I,
important
I
thing,
I mean, 18 months ago, I didn't think I'd have to moonlight as a utilities analyst just
right?
to get deeper insights into the freaking data center constraints and builds. And then I found an Equinox data center that's in South San Jose, and I'm driving around for it, looking to see what machines are on the backside for power generation. Like, what's happening now? I'm like a data center spy, trying to figure out what's sitting back there in components, or how the sidecar is working. Um, so yeah, it's again, it's interesting, but I also wonder, like, maybe that's why, and maybe this is just the bubble that I'm in, but then I am seeing so many people want to move and talk about the optical names, because even if you don't all of a sudden expand shipments, right, in doubling, the sheer shift from copper to fiber will benefit people even in a constrained environment. And so I do wonder if, to some degree, maybe that's some wise. I keep seeing a lot of these optical names start to come up, and people hunting for, it's not just Lumentum or Coherent, but testing with Ahir, and even Corning's come up more in my conversations, because you might have structural benefits from just replacement cycles than just pure growth cycles, I guess.
The idea that I have to start being an analyst covering replacement cycle of testing equipment is
I,
I
I'm
don't want I
I'm
don't
with
want to
you.
contemplate that.
I'm not going that deep. I'm just saying, like, these are the conversations that keep coming up. Like, they're just looking for those things, like structural benefits of
Sure.
a transition, again, from copper to fiber without a growth cycle. Like, that will be a structural benefit of a shift. So, all right. This week, also, our favorite company, Intel, has purchased back their share of the Apollo agreement for the Ireland fab. So, give us your thoughts on this, because this, I think, the main point was misinterpreted, which I know you'll hit. So let's start there.
So yeah, just some background. 2.5, 3 years ago, when Intel was in very tight financial situation and had a very shaky balance sheet, they did a series of deals where um, they did a sale leaseback. They sold their the real estate underneath their fabs to a real estate company, Brookfield, and then leased it back from them. Very common structure. And they did a few of those, including they did one with their main sort of production fab in Ireland, which they this is like the third one they did, and rather than doing it with a real estate company, they did it with a private equity fund, Apollo. And this week they announced they originally Intel had sold that plant for I think $11 billion, and this week they announced that they're buying that plant back from Apollo. They're buying back Apollo's 51% stake for $14 billion. So Apollo gets to make pocket $3 billion off that deal,
Yep.
plus whatever payments they got in between, and Intel now has complete control of that fab. And in the press release, it was a very loftily worded press release, like about all the great things and how they were such great partners and how they love working together, and what and Intel said, this is our strong commitment to the future of CPUs, whatever. And I think the deal was viewed very positively by the street. It's essentially accretive
Yeah.
to earnings.
Right.
Um, and I saw a lot of takes were like, oh, this is Intel betting on the future of semiconductors again. And yes, all those things are true. Oh well, it is accretive, I believe, and it is a strong, I would say, strong sign that Intel feels it's in better financial shape. And I don't think there's any question that they believed in the future of semiconductor manufacturing. Like we haven't asked that question in 6 months.
Right.
But I also think it was that deal with Apollo was a terrible deal. And I say that because the first two deals they did with Brookfield were very straightforward real estate deals. The one with Apollo had a lot of other things in it around operating metrics. It was a much funkier structure. And we don't know all the details. And believe me, I looked. The real details were redacted from the filings, but there were performance metrics in the contract. Intel had to hit certain performance targets. And if you all recall, a year ago they were not hitting those targets, um, with yield around 18A specifically. I believe that's actually
Mm-hmm.
in the contract.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just didn't make sense to be in that deal. I can only imagine, what the future terms would have required. The fact that Intel is willing to pay $14 billion to get out of it should tell you that it was pretty onerous. And so it's a good move for Intel to get out of from under that for a lot of reasons, but not
Yeah.
just the
So,
future of CPUs.
correct. Yeah. I think the right take, as you said, is that was a very bad deal. That deal would have taken an EPS hit, which they get back, and are in a better position financially because of it. That's the, like again, like what was Brookfield gonna do with their 40 something percent share? Like, they weren't taking out like capacity. Like, Intel had that capacity. Like, capacity was still there. It's just it was a terrible deal. Um, but I also find it interesting that kind of the reaction was, oh, Intel's so confident in the future. They're willing to make like these investments, and then the streets like rewarding these investments, when like 2 years ago it was like, Intel, get your spending under control. Like, why aren't you spending? Like, stop spending so much money. And now they're like, Intel, what the crap are you doing? Spend more money. There's capacity. There's share to be had. There's chips to sell, man. And you're at a constraint. So I just the irony of it is just that's what's got me. Um, but then I want you to comment on. I saw some people, big names from Southside Bank, say, "Hey, we'd love to see them get out of this deal with Brookfield for Fab 52." And I didn't have a thought on it, but you did. So I want you to share that because that might not be the right take.
Yeah, my take is that the Brookfield deal is much more benign. I haven't gone quite as deep into the filings for that one, but it certainly looked much more straightforward. It's a real estate deal. It does not. I do not believe it has any operating metrics in it. And they're just like renting a piece of land from Brookfield, and yeah, they could get out of it, and
Maybe they will someday, right? Who
maybe they will
knows?
someday. But like like the metrics there, the motivation to get out of there, I think, is much smaller. It's much more plain vanilla. For whatever reason, they got a little they they got a little creative, let's call it, with Apollo, and my guess is that they don't have the same urgency to get out of the Brookfield deal. Maybe again, there's something in there I missed, but my take is it's not, they, just to be clear, they still, don't have a great financial outlook in the sense of they still need to spend a lot of money on capex, and I would
Yeah.
rather have them buying tools than doing, paying buying back real estate at inflated, or not inflated prices, but higher prices. So my guess is they don't get out of the Brookfield one. I also don't think it matters much one way or the other, but at this point, I'd rather have them writing big checks to ASML than big checks to.
Yeah, keep expanding capacity.
Yeah.
That would absolutely be right. You need to keep making CPUs as the fastest rate possible, and CPU and stuff for other people. Um, one point on the MediaTek thing, not that they confirmed this or others, but let's just say there was a strong uh, suggestion that, as we were talking about, that they were an early design technology partner with TSMC. They also pointed out they are in that position as well with Intel, and customers like that. So they're not saying, oh, we're going to be anybody's confirmed Intel. There was a strong suggestion that there are people who want to do stuff on Intel, and I believe EMIB was a big part of that, which has been the going theory that I think is true. It's been mine forever, but um, it sounds like MediaTek's doing stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, MediaTek has been talking about Intel Foundry from the get-go practically. They were the first real sizable company to sign up, as far as I can remember, at least publicly, for Intel Foundry. And I again, EMIB advanced packaging is very hard to come by today, and makes a lot of sense, right? And I think again, it's one of these weird things where people just sort of discount MediaTek, and the fact that Intel was able to talk about MediaTek for so long and nobody sort of gave them much credit for it speaks as much to what we think about, is as much to how we sort of think about MediaTek as it does about Intel. Because it is, I mean, MediaTek's a big customer. They ship a lot of units.
Yep, yep. Well, something's brewing there ish.
Yeah.
Good, but good for Intel. Good for Intel. Like I said, the street rewarded it. I mean, again, I think your main point is everybody's feeling like they're in a better capital position, and I agree. I think that's the right take. Um, so anyway, that is it for this week. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we will talk to you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Tell your friends, tell your agents to subscribe to us, leave us a review,
Bring us all your claws.
bring us your claws.